Hello, my name is Roger Clark, and I'm your host today for this episode of the Fourscore and Seven Project. Today, we're discussing the unique dynamics of California politics, a very unique place in the United States of America. And the question is it the forerunner of the rest of the country, or is it a one-off? We have with us a distinguished professor, to talk to us about this issue, Professor Dan Schnur.
Roger, thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
Oh, we're so happy to have you here. It's going to be a great discussion today. And let me give you a little bit of background. Dan is a very busy man. He's a professor at Annenberg School of Communications at USC, or that's not the University of South Carolina, that's the University of Southern California, for those who might be confused by that. He's also a professor, School of Governmental Affairs, I believe, at Pepperdine University, and because he doesn't have enough to keep him busy otherwise, he also is a professor at the University of California at Berkeley, the Bears, who has now abandoned the Pac-12 along with some other schools, and Cal is what now, a member next year of
the improbably University of California is going to be a member of the Atlantic Coast Conference.
Atlantic Coast Conference, go figure.
And what's left behind is the Pac-2, as near as I can tell.
Well, maybe we'll get into that discussion a little bit as well. But Dan, thank you so much for being here. California politics. You teach this. You've taught it for years. My stats might be a little bit off, but let me just kind of kick this off and just put some statistical demographics on it. California, I think 35% of Californians are demographically categorized as white. About 40% there or about are identified as Hispanic, 15% Asian, and only 5% African American. A few percentage, I think, are there for possibly Pacific Islanders and things of that nature. So whites is not even a plurality. Non-Hispanic whites are not even a plurality in the state. So it's a very unique demographic makeup when it's compared to most of the rest of the United States. Is that, do you think, a harbinger of the future of the entire country, or is California a one-off?
Well, when you talk about the state's demographics, no question that it has been a unique mix and a unique level of diversity, as you mentioned, Roger. But we are beginning to see those same trends emerging in other parts of the country. First in some of the other Sun Belt states, in Florida and Texas and Georgia and Arizona most notably. But now we're seeing this across the country, that given the level of migration into the U.S. over the years, we're seeing perhaps not quite this level of diversity, but a much greater demographic mix in most of the United States than we've seen in the past. So at least in that sense, the demography in California really is a forerunner to what we'll see across most of the U.S. in the years ahead. Of course, the question is whether the political trends that emerge as a result of those shifts will follow nationally the way they, along the lines of the way the political landscape has changed here in California.
Well, let me ask you about that, because to an untrained mind like mine, well, thanks, but politics are probably a lot simpler when you're dealing with a homogeneous population. And so when you have people from different cultures, different racial and ethnic backgrounds, it strikes me that complicates politics. In a certain sense, to borrow an old saying, it's kind of corralling cats. How does California deal with such unique racial and ethnic mix-up politically?
Well, it's been a real challenge, and at times it's been a real struggle. We live in the most demographically diverse place in the history of the planet Earth. And there are times when that diversity brings great strength. It brings a multiple range of perspectives and experiences that can fuel a state's or a community's growth. But there's times, as you suggested, when it creates or intensifies some divisions and makes it much more difficult to move forward. Interesting, though, when you talk about those divisions, the types of things that divide us, not just here in California, but nationally, to a large degree, they've changed over the years. Gallup did some polling on this not too long ago. And they asked Americans, would you be comfortable with your son or your daughter marrying someone of a different race or religion? And the overwhelming majority of Californians, the overwhelming majority of Americans said they'd be completely comfortable with that. Those numbers were at an all-time high. It's a question they've been asking for years. Then they asked, would you be comfortable if your son or daughter married someone from the opposite political party? And the numbers were at an all-time low. So on one hand, we are becoming more tolerant and more respectful of our differences in terms of demography and heritage. On the other hand, we're becoming less tolerant and more divided when it comes to how we think.
And to politics. Well, that's just fascinating. So if my son is a Democrat, the Gallup polling says that most parents would say, I don't want him to marry a Republican, and or vice versa.
Exactly right. But again, I think it's important to mark the progress. Asking the same question 20, 30, 50, 100 years ago about someone from a different racial or religious background, Americans would have been much more uncomfortable with it. Today we're learning to recognize the benefits of that type of diversity. Again, we're just becoming a little bit less tolerant to ideological diversity, and that runs in both directions too.
Well, let's kind of focus then. I mean, California is a great test case since it's the forerunner of what is coming in the rest of the United States. Put it into politics, because here the hot topic, and has been for a long time, is identity politics. And identity politics means you identify people from visible marks, whether it's gender or race traditionally. And it raises the question then, if we're dealing with identity politics, how can we, and this, some people may not even like this term anymore, but traditionally the United States was deemed to be the, quote, melting pot. A lot of people don't even like that term anymore. But how do we meld ourselves if we have certain types of identity politics and there's a strong allegiance with certain identity groups, with certain political parties, and they're not intermarrying?
So a couple of things. I mean, you raised several good points. One, in fact, the rate of intermarriage between people of different racial and ethnic and religious backgrounds is increasing, not decreasing, even in an era right. of identity politics. But even the verb meld, believe it or not, can be a highly charged one for debate. Yes. Because you correctly pointed out to how for most of the United States history, we looked at the idea of a melting pot as something for which to strive. Right. Well, in recent years, you have, as you correctly pointed out, we have seen a challenge to that. And the metaphor that you now hear more frequently than a melting pot is a fruit salad. The idea that you have these different ingredients that mix together and cohabitate but still maintain their initial distinct identity. Now, when you get to questions of identity politics, and this is something I talk about in all of my classes at great length because it's of tremendous import to Generation Z. And I tell them that identity politics, as you've defined it, I said there's a real positive that comes along with it, but there's a real challenge and a potential negative that comes along as well. So let me go through both. The first is, I say, your identity, your heritage, is definitionally who you are. It would be odd if that wasn't important to you. Right. It would be odd if it was completely irrelevant to your politics. I said, that said, when you begin to define identity in an exclusionary way, that people who aren't from my racial or ethnic or religious heritage are people who I don't have anything to talk to about. Mm-hmm. I said, that's where you run into trouble. And an example I give quite frequently is I will point to one of my teaching assistants, someone who I'd known before the semester started. I'll say, okay, this is a young Latina woman. I am an old white man. If we practice identity politics the way it's currently defined, we have nothing to say to each other. We have nothing to gain, we have nothing to learn because we come from different places. That said, once we take the time to start talking, once we take the time to start listening to each other, we realize that we might not share the most obvious, invisible identities, but there's a lot of other identities that we do share. None of us contains a single identity. We all contain dozens, if not hundreds. So when this young woman and I talk about the experience that her parents had coming here from Latin America and the experience that my grandparents had coming here from Eastern Europe, realize in that sense our identities aren't as different as they seemed at the outset. So there's nothing wrong at all with being proud of who you are and where you're from, as long as you recognize that your identities are much more complicated than that. And while it takes more time and more effort to look beyond those most obvious identifying characteristics, it's usually worth the effort.
And that's a great point. I know a lot of our listeners are wondering, where did this whole concept of identity politics originate? Maybe it's always been around. Maybe it's the fact that it's just got a new buzzword associated with it to define what it is. But the whole concept of identity politics strikes so many of the people who watch the program as being a divider, not a uniter. Your thoughts on that?
And as we were talking about a moment ago, it can be. And the easier route is to let your demographic identity be a divider. But again, the point I try to make to these young people is it's worth the extra effort to talk with someone with whom it might not immediately seem that you share an identity. But if you dig a little bit deeper and listen a little bit more carefully, you realize that while you don't share that most visible identity, you share a lot of other identities that are worth talking about. But to your question, where did this come from?
Well, where did it? Yes.
Well, this concept, as you correctly pointed out, Roger, it's as old as humanity. It did get
it's been labeled.
It got a clever new name in the relatively recent past. But we are a tribal species. And you can go back to prehistoric eras. And when our earliest human ancestors would go out hunting and gathering, they learned very quickly that they were much more likely to catch a saber-toothed tiger for dinner if they banded together. And they learned very quickly that they'd be much better prepared to protect themselves against another band of humans if they worked together and cooperated. So this, over the millennia, this isn't cultural, this isn't social. At this point, this is hardwired in us. It is a biological, chemical track. And there have been studies done on this that show that people are so intent on preserving, on maintaining their role as part of their defined tribe, they're willing to make decisions, they're willing to take actions that they disagree with, and that actively work against their own best interest in order to stay part of the group. And whenever any of my students doubts me on that last point, I ask them, has anybody in this room ever pledged a fraternity or sorority? Remember the things they made you do in your pledging? Oh, yeah. But you were willing to do them because it was that important to become part of the tribe with those Greek letters on your chest. So that's who we are as human beings. And that tribalism has become much more apparent in politics in the modern era than it has previously.
It strikes me it's been weaponized.
Yes.
I mean, so what you label something, you define it.
Yeah.
And so it's identity, and then we get into issues. Once upon a time, people would assume assimilation is a good thing. On Friday night I eat pizza. It never occurs to me that I eat an Italian, right? But we've assimilated, part of the Italian culture, but now the counterpoint to that is it's appropriating a culture, and that's bad. And so for political purposes, it seems like this whole concept of identity politics has been weaponized for the purpose of political gain. I mean, is that a correct observation?
It's a very correct observation, and it leads directly from a major change that's taken place in our politics over the last generation or so. For most of not just American history, but for most of the history of democracies in human history, generally, when voters supported a candidate, they voted for that candidate because they admired that person, because they liked them, because they believed in them. What we've seen happen in recent years is the overwhelming majority of voters, not just here in the US, but elsewhere, now cast their ballots not based on the candidate who they like and admire, but they cast their ballots against the candidate of the party who they dislike, who they disdain. And so at that point, once you begin to look at that person across the aisle as the other, then that identity, instead of being a potential bridge, becomes a wall.
Well, that's a negative vote.
They call it, and the term in political science is negative partisanship. And what we've seen over the last few election cycles is that more and more Americans say to themselves and to each other, I don't really like either of them, but I like that one even less, so I'm going to vote for this one.
Is that, well, I bet there's a lot of people out there that will hear this and say, that is not healthy. That's not a healthy way to elect our representatives.
I would broaden their concern. It's not only is it not a healthy way to elect politicians, I don't know that it's a healthy way to go through life.
I'm sure there's a lot of medical specialties out there, specialists will say, that's terrible. All it's going to do is drive up your blood pressure and everything else.
Well, and of course what we have as a result is not just a divided politics, but we've divided communities and divided society. People who cling to their tribe so closely that to talk to someone who disagrees with them is seen as an abdication. It's seen as a forfeiting of some aspect of their identity. Think about it. If you and I are negotiating in business, we both know that neither of us can get everything we want. And so we negotiate out a deal that's as good as possible for both sides. That's the way politics has worked for most of our history. I'm not going to get everything you want. You're not going to get everything you want. We'll figure this out. But if you begin to take your political positions, not based on what's in your material interest, but based on what it says about you as a person, compromise means you're not just compromising on an issue, you're compromising a matter of your identity. You're forfeiting a part of who you are. And so voters who've learned to hate those people over on the other side, I can't compromise with them. They're evil. And so the two sides retreat further and further apart.
That's very troubling because we used to pride ourselves in this country on our power of assimilation. And it raises the question, California, once again, is a great test case for powers of assimilation. And of course, now we have so many, subtext going on that a lot of people believe that this country is inherently evil based upon, so what's good to assimilate? And we don't want to assimilate anything, we want to cancel it, and we want to form something new. And then there's another group of people who say we want to preserve the traditional values, they're worth being to assimilate them. But yet we've now gotten ourselves into these walled off communities where people don't want to talk. I mean, who's responsible for that? I mean, we all want to know, this is just, is it organic, or is there something in the law that kind of drove this, or the change in politics that got us to this point?
Well, we are all somewhat responsible for it. But first of all, before we go on, I just want to clarify a point that I made a moment ago when I was talking about how much more polarized we are. Yeah. I don't want to over-idealize the past. When you and I were coming up, the two parties argued very vociferously. The difference is, when they had to, they found the ability to put aside their differences for the common good. So when you look at the person on the other side as your opponent and not your enemy, you can say, okay, I don't agree with them on everything, but we have to work this out. The country needs it. And that's what's become harder and harder. I tell my students about Ronald Reagan and Tip O'Neill working together to save Social Security.
Tip O'Neill was Speaker of the House during the
Reagan administration,
full administration.
So Republican president, Democratic speaker, and I don't sugarcoat it. I said most of the time, they went at each other pretty hard, but together, they combined, they teamed up to save Social Security from bankruptcy. A decade later, Republican House Speaker Newt Gingrich and Democratic President Bill Clinton, who fought fiercely in the political wars, put aside, albeit temporarily, their differences to balance the budget and enact other policy reforms. And Roger, it's interesting, my students, these Gen Zers, they don't doubt me. They don't think I'm making this up. But I might as well be telling them about the butter churn and the 8-track tape player. There's just nothing in modern society today to which they can associate.
It's all historical to them. So if I hear what you're saying, and that's a beautiful thing about being a professor, is that you hang around with young people all the time. And it keeps you fresh, what's current, new ideas, new perspectives, a lot of energy, ambition. It keeps you young, I suspect.
And keeps me optimistic.
But yet here you're talking to these 18 to 23, 24 year olds, and you're telling them something that's really profound, but they're not relating to it.
And something that's unfamiliar to them. And I think it, to a large degree, explains why the rates of voting participation among these young people is so much lower. These young people, obviously, they vote in much smaller numbers than any other generation. But they also volunteer their time back into their communities at very high levels. So they're still looking for that cohesive, collegial action on behalf of their communities. They just don't see it coming from traditional politics. They see it coming from their volunteer activity, and our challenge is to explain to them that it can't be one or the other, it has to be both.
So are you saying we no longer have the art of compromise that we once had?
Not in the slightest. Certainly not in politics, but more and more in other facets of life also. We see it in our communities, we see it in our neighborhoods.
Unable to compromise.
Precisely. And we become more and more divided, not just in terms of partisan politics, but as a society. You asked earlier whose fault it was. And ultimately it's all of ours, but let's...
Well, maybe that was a bad choice of word, the cause. We can
Okay.
talk about the cause as opposed to attributing fault.
Well, all right. So first of all, there are many causes, but I will point to just one. And that is the incredible influence of digital media and social media. Now, I'm not a druid. I believe that the benefits of communications technology far outweigh the downsides. But what online media, and in particular social media, allows us to do, it allows us to self-select who we talk to, who we listen to, what we read, what we learn, and ultimately what we think. Look, when I grew up, my father and I disagreed profoundly on politics. Like
I
most
bet that
fathers and
wasn't the
sons.
first time that's ever happened.
Probably not. But we would watch the evening news together, and we might come to extremely different conclusions about what we saw. But at least we're drinking from the same pool of information.
Right.
Well, if one person's watching Fox and the other's watching MSNBC, if one's on a conservative website and the other's on a liberal website, if one's listening to a Democratic podcast and the other's listening to a Republican podcast, we're not just disagreeing, we're experiencing two entirely different versions of reality. And this doesn't happen by accident. And I am not, like I said, I'm not a technophobe. I think the benefits of technology far outweigh the downsides. But the social media companies in particular exacerbate this trend. Most of your audience is educated enough to have read about or heard about the algorithms that are used to determine social media exposure. And what that means is that when you read or watch or listen to something on a particular topic, Meta or Snapchat or TikTok or whoever it is, they're going to bring you more of that. So let's say that you like videos about puppies. Well, they will just keep sending you videos of puppies and never ever show you one of a kitten. Whereas if you have a friend who likes kitten videos, they'll only see the kitten videos and never see any puppies. Now, if it's pets, no big deal. But, and it's not because they're evil, because they're not. Right. It's not because they're looking to divide us, because they're not. But they're businesses. And they know that if they keep showing you puppy videos, you'll stay on their site. So if instead of puppies and kittens, it's videos and information and opinion about liberal and conservative politics and policy, one audience member is going to get a steady diet and a steady stream of what Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez think. Another audience member is going to get just as steady a stream of what Donald Trump thinks. A third audience member is going to just get what a Mitt Romney thinks. But instead of watching the same newscast and coming to different conclusions about it, each one of us has the potential, at least, to live in almost an ideological igloo, if you will. And we're never challenged. We're never disagreed with. Rather, our opinions are just reinforced, and we're congratulated for having them. So I'll just finish this up real quick. So this is human nature. Human nature. If I want to listen to the smartest people in the world, who are the smartest people in the world? They're the people who agree with me. So what we have to do, our responsibility is well-informed individuals, is to step beyond our natural instincts and say, even if I don't agree with it, I'm going to make an effort to read or listen to or be exposed to opinions that are different than mine. Not because they're going to change my mind, but just because they're going to better equip me to participate in a broader range of conversations.
You're talking about your disagreements that you had with your father growing up. My big disagreement with my father is that he always was convinced that the best heavyweight boxer of all time was Joe Louis. And I was of obviously a different generation. I said, no, it's Muhammad Ali. And we never saw eye to eye on that. So I understand the dilemma you had with your father on politics.
Well, and of course the generational divide is a perfect example. There's an old joke, they say, the one thing everyone of all ages can agree on is we all know absolutely, with absolute confidence, that the best music ever written came out when we were in high school.
Good point.
Everyone sees the world through their own window.
Well, let me challenge you, though, on the statement that you, and let me kind of make a hypothetical, which may or may not be entirely accurate, may be completely off. Maybe it is accurate. But you said that the benefits of the technology, communication technology, far outweigh the detriment. But yet, I just heard you describe very negative outcomes of this, because if the technology contributes the communications technology specifically contributes in a material way to dividing us to the point where we're not listening to each other, and if we're not listening to others, it seems to me, and I probably a lot to our listeners too, to a dysfunctional nation and democracy, which could be self-destructive. So what's the positive on the communications technology that outweighs the threat that it may, at the end point, destroy us as a nation, as a community, or a culture?
Oh my goodness, maybe we should have started with the positives of communication technology and then gone to this. I think there's many, but I'll offer one in particular, especially as it relates to political discourse. The average voter today in 2024 is more empowered to participate in the political conversation than at any other time in human history. The tools of digital media and social media not only give us the opportunity to talk back to power vertically in a way that never existed in human history before, but I'd say just as, if not even more importantly, it allows us to communicate and coordinate horizontally. We can organize as citizens in a much more effective and efficient and impactful way because of these tools than were ever available before. If you and I wanted to organize a protest rally 50 years ago, well, we would have gotten out a mimeograph machine and we would have handed out flyers on corners and we would have made phone calls and we would have hoped for the best.
Right.
Well, the tools of technology allow us to reach a much greater audience and organize much more effectively than ever before. And I do think that empowers the voice of the average citizen in a really important, sometimes annoying, but on balance, really beneficial way. So the technology, on one hand, it can divide us.
Well, and it has.
It has.
It has.
But it can also empower us. Mm-hmm. I guess the other distinction I would draw is the technology can divide us, but we are entirely capable as sentient human beings of overcoming that should we so choose to. At the end of every semester, last day of class, every December and every May, I tell my students, I said, I'm going to give you one last assignment. It's the last day of class. I can't grade this one. But it's the most important assignment I'm going to give you all semester long. I said, I want every principled conservative in this class to watch Rachel Maddow once a week. And I want every principled progressive, every principled liberal in this room to read George Will or Ross Douthat or Bret Stephens once a week. I'm not trying to change your mind. I'm not even trying to open it. I'm just trying to remind you that there's really smart people over there on the other side too, who you might not happen to agree with. But just because you don't agree with them doesn't make them evil or stupid. Ben Sasse, the former Republican senator from Nebraska, who's now the president of the University of Florida, he has a great term that he likes to use. He calls it nutpicking, as opposed to nitpicking. And what he means by nutpicking is you pick out the weirdest, loudest, most obnoxious, most unreasonable voice over on the other side, and use them as a reason why you can't work with those people. I can't work with Democrats. Look at that ridiculous Ilhan Omar. I can't work with Republicans. Marjorie Taylor Greene is out of her mind. And I think while those divisions that we were talking about earlier can be intensified by social media, we have it within our power to overcome them as long as we're willing to resist the impulse to retreat into that ideological comfort zone. I've always found that the people who I admire most intellectually, the smartest people, the most impressive thinkers, are those who are willing to have their ideas challenged in the public square. And in order to have your ideas challenged, you need to step outside that comfort zone. So it is a downside, the division, but I think the empowering aspect of communications technology outweighs it. And I think it outweighs it even more when we have enough confidence in ourselves and our ideas to allow them to be challenged.
Let me challenge you. Once again, I hear you loud and clear. I agree that's a wonderful solution. The last assignment you give to your students, superb. I love it. But this is my concern. You're talking to a limited group of people. We're talking about hundreds of millions of people who don't have the benefit of that insight, and yet we're swimming against a powerful upstream of technology giants that weaponize, if I can borrow that term, because they want us to keep coming back and having the same steady diet of the stuff that we saw or read yesterday, we're going to read today, and we're going to read again tomorrow. Gets us to the point where we only hear one side of the story, which leads us to believe that anybody else who doesn't agree with us, they're just evil, or they're idiots, or they're stupid, or whatever, we want. So I love your optimism, but maybe I've just become too much of a pessimist. How do you overcome such powerful economic inertia against what you preach or teach? Preach is not the right word, teach.
Well, I think the question is the exact right one. And I don't think these problems get solved from Washington, D.C., or from Sacramento, or from City Hall. I think they have to be solved in a community. There's been plenty of research done on questions of trust. Who do we as citizens trust? Do we trust politicians? Not so much. Journalists? Not really. Who do we trust? We trust each other. We trust our friends, we trust our neighbors, we trust our coworkers. And so to me, the way you model this behavior is not by having elected officials or famous journalists say, this is what we do. But this country's strength from its beginning, and de Tocqueville wrote about this in the 19th century, is the community-based organizations that bring a village, a city, a state together. Those organizations, whether it's chambers of commerce or Rotaries or PTAs, those organizations that decide that they're going to encourage that kind of behavior and that kind of thinking, I think that's where the change gets made. Not because we're told from Washington or Sacramento it has to, but because people like us in a community turn to our friends and neighbors when we gather for bowling night and say, hey, why don't we listen to what that other person has to say?
Well, on the issue of Washington, which is probably the most unpopular place to be, at least in the eyes of most Americans now, we all have lost faith in what Washington can do or fails to do or what it does do. But is there any legislation, anything from a political standpoint through the law that could be done? And I realize we're butting up against the First Amendment here, where we can pare back the social media giants' algorithms that give us a constant diet, feeding us on the same thing over and over again. Is there anything legislatively that you can see on the horizon that might prevent that from occurring into the foreseeable future?
Well, and this is something that Congress is struggling with right now. I think there's a realization on both sides of the aisle that the early years of social media would have benefited from not edict, but more guidance. And that many of our elected officials didn't really understand the challenge in the technology. And so therefore, it's allowed to flourish and often in unhealthy ways. My own opinion is they're doing what politicians do best, which is overcorrect And now that artificial intelligence has become our next great technology-based challenge, they're going to try to make up for their lack of attention and action on social media and probably overdo it on the AI side. But there's considerable debate that is going on in Washington. It's intensifying primarily, we're getting a little bit off topic here, but it's worth raising, primarily around the topic of children's safety online. I've been hearings in Washington on this, and
heated hearings too.
Very heated, very heated hearings. And just to pick out one example, back in the 1990s, in the early years of the internet, Congress passed a bill called the Communications Decency Act. And in it, there were protections for technology companies, for internet companies, from lawsuits based on the content. Because the companies argued, we're not advocating this content. We're just simply a platform on which other people speak. And the common realization among Democrats and Republicans that seems to be emerging is that's probably letting the technology companies off the hook just a little bit too easily. Because if you put up content that can be dangerous to a young person, you're not just a platform. You're an enabler. And these are difficult questions, but I think belatedly, we're beginning to see our elected representatives starting to wrestle with them. But it's a confounding set of challenges. I would offer you this for just a little bit of solace. One of my favorite quotes is from Mark Twain. He said, "History doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes."
Gotta love Mark Twain.
Absolutely. If you look back at every other advancement in communications technology throughout human history, we had exactly the same kind of difficulty coming to terms with it. Television, radio. There was a story in the New York Times in the mid-19th century warning about the societal damage that would be wrought by the telephone. That once telephones become commonplace, people retreat into their homes, they will no longer socialize with each other. This is going to be absolutely horrible. I go back even further.
You're not going to go back to the printing press, are you?
After the Gutenberg Bible, or excuse me, after the printing press was invented, Protestants and Catholics went to war for hundreds of years across Europe. When you democratize information, it divides people because people develop stronger feelings. And it takes some time for us to learn how to use these new communications tools, whether it's Instagram or television or the telephone or the printing press. We haven't been here before, but we've been here before.
It's rhymed. We're rhyming.
Yes.
So I love your optimism, Professor. Let me ask you, we're almost out of time for today's episode. But let me ask you to give us a litmus test. So I love your optimism. You're seeing that the positives from the current telecommunications technology outweighs the detriment. What would you have to experience for you to change your mind and conclude that the negatives do indeed outweigh the positives?
So what you're asking me is, what would it take to turn my optimism into pessimism?
So someday in the future, you're sitting in a class and you look at your students and say, I was wrong. What would have to happen for you to make that comment to your students?
Boy, it's a great question. And I have to admit, first of all, I should just say more broadly, I refer to myself as a born-again ingenue. I started out in life as an optimist. I became very cynical. And now I've come back around full circle. And one of the reasons I'm so optimistic is because even though it's a self-selected group, as you pointed out, I get to spend most of my week, every week, with some of the most impressive young people on the planet. And so I can't help but to believe that they're going to take on these challenges successfully. What would it take to change my mind? I have to say, I don't want to sound naive. I can't bear the thought. If I had to wake up in the morning and just say, it's all hopeless, there's no point, that just sounds absolutely excruciating. So I'm not saying that I would be oblivious to the information you presented to me, and it might alter the way I look at things, but I simply could not admit as a human being that we as a species can't find a way to overcome the challenges that we've created for ourselves.
Well, Professor Dan Schnur, I hope we can have you back for part
I would
two of
love
this
it.
interview. And this has been a fascinating conversation. I look forward to continuing this conversation with you on our next episode. Professor Dan Schnur, ladies and gentlemen, I hope you enjoyed this program today discussing California politics and that it's a harbinger of the rest of the United States and all the fascinating issues that a very diverse population presents to politics, complicated with our very unique telecommunications technology that we're facing today. If you've enjoyed this program, please like and share. And also, we're very interested in having your comments posted if you have the time. Thank you very much and have a good day.